Greetings and salutations, everyone, for this week's installment of a reaction video, and this week's reaction video is on the questioning the timeline of the ancient world. This is a clip, at least a 45-minute clip, if my head doesn't actually reveal. It is because my head's blocking it, in other words. This is a 45-minute clip reviewing the timeline of the ancient world, put forth by David Rohl and Tim Mahoney and his film crew from the popular documentary series called Patterns of Evidence. Excuse me here. I seem to be having a frog in my throat. In which, now if you guys aren't familiar with Patterns of Evidence, this is a documentary series put forth by Tim Mahoney, and he actually interviews David Rohl, and it seems like he fully supports changing the ancient Egyptian chronology by 300 years, which, to my knowledge, no scholar entertains. If you guys aren't familiar with David Rohl has a bachelor's degree in Egyptology from University College University in London. Excuse me. But he actually holds no PhD. He's published several books on his chronology, dating back to 1995, when he first introduced his chronology. I would like to further explain that I am not Tim Mahoney, and I am not the creator of Patterns of Evidence. I say that just so that YouTube does not flag me for copyright. I am not the creator of Patterns of Evidence. I am merely doing a reactionary video here in this clip. So I just want to lay that out for you guys. Furthermore, if this is your first time here, welcome. What we normally do here on this channel is Tuesday or Wednesday, we actually read through the Old Testament in Biblical Hebrew. I read like 3 or 4 chapters weekly in Hebrew with the English Standard Version alongside, so you guys can follow, unless you guys want to follow on your own. And then every Friday I release a reactionary video relating to the Old Testament. We've discussed in the past more of the Exodus. We've discussed the flood and young earth creationists' version of the flood. But today I just wanted to go back to the Exodus again in David Rohl's chronology. So, without further ado, though, we will go ahead and dive right into this. So, here we go.
David Rohl, author, historian, and Egyptologist, is an agnostic. Someone who remains unconvinced of the existence of God. Yet, he clearly sees archaeological evidence of the biblical Joseph, Jacob, and the early Hebrews in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. Rohl believes that many Egyptologists have missed evidence for the Exodus because they have been looking for it in the wrong time period. While most scholars think that the events of the Exodus happened in the New Kingdom, David Rohl's view would put the Exodus in an entirely different period, the earlier Middle Kingdom, where he claims evidence for the Exodus can be seen.
After this 12-year investigation, I too have come to see that the Middle Kingdom was the only place where a sequential pattern of evidence matching every step of the Exodus events can be found. This leads to a new question. Why is this evidence showing up so much earlier than expected? David Rohl's solution was to propose a radical idea. He had identified problems with Egypt's history unrelated to the Bible. When he shifted Egypt's timeline by centuries to fix the problems, The result was that this pattern of evidence matching the Exodus now lined up with the biblical dates for these events.
Other good scholars maintain that you don't need to change Egypt's timeline in order to see evidence for the Exodus.
And absolutely, you don't need to change the Egyptian chronology to fit the narrative. That is to say, you don't need to change the Egyptian chronology in order to find evidence for the Exodus. Me being the late date proponent of the Exodus that I am, I think there's substantial evidence of an Exodus. I think there's a lot of evidence for the Exodus to have occurred during the middle of the 13th century. And honestly speaking, I think there's more evidence to say that it even occurred in the early date of the Exodus, an early date suggesting in the 15th century, 1446, than there is for changing the timeline. Although I don't support an early date of the Exodus because I just don't think that's where the evidence is. So
James Hoffmeyer believes textual clues in the Bible point to the Exodus happening at the 1250 BC Ramesses Day. Bryant Wood and Charles Ayling believe the Exodus occurred around 1450 BC, using the conventional dates for Egypt and Canaan. They believe a case can be made for Israelites living in Egypt prior to that time.
And it's funny that he uses the term Israelites here because, yes, Jacob's name was changed in Genesis 17 to Israel, but I think it's more, we should be more aware of the notion that the descendants of Jacob were in Egypt, and that Israel as a nation, as a collective nation, excuse me, was not around at the time. This was a mixed multitude, as Deuteronomy 7:7 says, that left Egypt. So yes, the descendants of Israel or of Jacob were living in Egypt, and they were part of that mixed multitude population. However, I don't think it is necessary, as Hoffmeyer would probably argue, as Bryant Wood would probably argue, Dr. Bryant Wood, and Dr. Hoffmeyer would argue, to change the timeline. It's just simply not necessary. So.
And later Israel appearing as a nation in Canaan. So an exodus of some kind must have taken place.
And he's absolutely right. We actually have evidence of some kind of exodus taking place. There's some kind of exodus taking place. This is the reason why I reject the pastoralist revolt model put forward by Dr. Israel Finkelstein. I think there is evidence of an actual exodus from Egypt, whether that's textual evidence, not just the Exodus, the book of Exodus, but I think there's textual evidence from Papyrus Anastasi, and its respective, there are, I think, 6 letters of Papyrus Anastasi, or 6 papyri of Anastasi. And then you've got the archaeological excavations put forth by Manfred Bitak at Tel El Daba. And then their entrance into Canaan, I think there's evidence of Palestinian archaeology to suggest that there was some, that's where a foreign people group, if you will, entered Canaan, whether there were, lack of pig bones and things like that. So yes, I think there is evidence of an exodus. Do we need to change the timeline? No, I don't think we need to change the timeline. You may hear me say that multiple times, but
the only place that I saw a pattern matching all the steps was in the Middle Kingdom, not the New Kingdom. And if that's not a coincidence, it would require some kind of major change. Either the Exodus happened long before 1450, or the dates for Egypt's timeline are off.
The debate over the dates of ancient history.
And I just want to point this out here. I think they're actually meaning the University of Tübingen in Germany, not Tübingen. So, just trying to say that. probably put forth because Tim Mahoney doesn't know German. And that's perfectly fine. That doesn't bother me so much, but...
is intensifying, while the conclusions of those who support major adjustments differ in their details. They're all of the same mind that these things are worth investigating, and that chronology is not yet fixed and is not yet final. Researchers like Rohl and Bimson believe the main problem lies in these lesser-known dark periods of Egypt's past. They think scholars have miscalculated their lengths, causing distortions in the dates for everything before them. The biggest suspect is this very long third dark period, which new information suggests has been overinflated by centuries. If it were reduced, the history of Egypt would need to move forward in time.
Completely unnecessary.
For many years, I was intimidated by the giant of Egypt's dating. But what made me take a second look was when I learned that it's been necessary to insert gaps into the histories of all the surrounding civilizations in order to match the dating of Egypt's third dark period. Yet the archaeology of these cultures does not seem to support such gaps.
I would argue to the contrary here. The collapse of the New Kingdom, what we call the Late Bronze Age collapse, occurred, at least according to Dr. Eric Klein, around 1187, 85, give or take a few years. And it seems to have occurred around the same time. The Hittites collapsed at the same time. Greece or Mycenae's civilization collapsed at the same time, along with Cyprus, which I think was owned by the Hittite Empire at the time. So these civilizations, along with Egypt, Egypt really didn't experience a collapse, but more of a decline. Along with the Middle Assyrian Empire. The Middle Assyrian Empire didn't actually collapse. It more or less declined. The Hittite Empire collapsed. So did Mycenae. But the thing is that all of these things occurred at the same time, roughly, give or take 1 or 2 years. The city of Ugarit, which isn't even mentioned here, the city of Ugarit collapsed at the same time because of the Sea People's invasion. So, around the same time. So, with Egypt, they were a bit more successful. They repelled the Libyan invasion. And then they repelled the Sea People's invasion, and that allowed the Sea Peoples to set up camp or set up their Pentapolis in Canaan. So you get the Philistines there. So at least that's what I hold. That's what I believe. So you get the collapses, or at least the decline of certain civilizations around the same time. So contrary to what Tim Mahoney here says, yes, the archaeological evidence, the textual evidence seems to support a collapse or decline of some kind in the 12th century. So
Something was wrong.
What might history look like if the dark periods were adjusted the way that some scholars believe the evidence demands?
I would actually say that's unusual, considering we actually have textual evidence and archaeological evidence to support, again, a decline or collapse of certain civilizations. Again, I don't think it's necessary to change the timeline 300 years.
What are you proposing?
My whole thesis is that we have to look for the Israelite sojourn and slavery and Exodus in a much earlier period than is normally believed. So most Egyptologists will place the Exodus in the 19th dynasty. I would place it at the end of the 13th dynasty, when we have the archaeological evidence that matches the story. They have no archaeological evidence to match the story in the 19th dynasty, so the problem here is they then say it's fictional. They say...
Not exactly. Yes, there are Egyptologists, yes, there are scholars who say that the Exodus narrative laid out in Exodus 7 through 12 or even like just the whole Exodus narrative, is fictional. Yes, there are scholars that say that. However, there are scholars who put it in the 19th dynasty who still believe the Exodus happened. I really dislike Rohl's claim here that the Exodus narrative is fictional, and that people who put the Exodus in the 13th century is fictional. I just think it's ludicrous, because there are scholars who think the Exodus really did happen in the 13th century, and they don't take it as a work of fiction. One of the things, in my last reactionary video with Doctors Costa and Petrovich said something, I think in the second or third video that I did last week or 2 weeks ago, and I just thought he said something interesting, that the Patterns of Evidence film was brought up in the interview between the two doctors, Costa and Petrovich, and even Petrovich said that he urged Mahoney not to pursue this timeline change of the Exodus with David Rohl. I thought that was telling, that Petrovich was even saying, don't do this. So, but anyway.
The story doesn't really happen. So you place it in the wrong time, then you argue it never happened. What a weird way to do history.
When considering the conventional Exodus dates of 1250 BC or 1450 BC, there's no doubt that most mainstream scholars have become very skeptical after finding no evidence for the Exodus or conquest at either of these options. Both of these dates fall within the Late Bronze Age, when the New Kingdom...
That was, I think that was Dr. Finkelstein there you just saw, and he takes the pastoralist revolt model, in which Israel, or the Israelites, if you will, overthrew their conquerors and established the nation, the monarchy. So what happens, and I'm going to straw man his argument here, I'm sorry, but so what happens, he thinks that the conquest was the Israelites rebelled against their overlords, if you will, and established Israel. That's the pastoralist revolt model. Now, that's a quick explanation. There is more to it in his defense of the model. But if you want to read more, he is on academia. He does have books published. Dr. Israel Finkelstein is his name. So if you want more on his view, that's the name to search for, Israel Finkelstein. So I'll just let him continue.
The 18th and 19th dynasties were ruling Egypt. Israeli archaeologist Zeev Herzog addressed the problem of a lack of evidence matching the conquest at the site of Jericho during the Late Bronze Age. The question of the conquest there at Jericho, is there a place called Jericho?
Before Herzog goes into his argument here, I will let him speak the whole thing, and then after he's finished, I will address certain things. So.
Was it destroyed?
Yes. Well, Jericho is a very nice, good example because of but it has nothing to do with the chronology. It has to do with the fact that there was no city there in the Late Bronze Age which was fortified by city walls and which was destroyed in fire, as it is described in the book of Joshua. So this is, and there is no, it cannot be argument, chronological argument. There is an earlier occupation there, there is some later occupation, but not fortified in the Iron Age. But in this period, which generally is accepted as the expected date of the conquest, which is the Late Bronze Age, the late 13th century BC, there's no city there.
The Bible states that the Exodus happened around 1450 BC, according to the temple,
yes.
And back timing it in that, which would put it at an earlier date than the time that archaeologists today put the Exodus. There's a several hundred-year difference. Would it then more match the Jericho destruction that is found in archaeology?
No, there is no, even this early date is not supported by archaeology. There was no such a city in 1400 as well as in the 13th century. So this would not provide. There were always excuses. I mean, that there were city walls, but they were washed away. That they reused the ancient city walls, continued to use them. But there is no evidence for this. These are hypotheses, because if someone reuses, they have to rebuild them, you have to have floors, you have to have pottery on the floors, which date, and this was not found. This was not the case.
So in the Middle Bronze Age, when was Jericho destroyed? That's the question.
Well, this I did not study it exactly, but sometimes in the late 17th or even in the 16th century, it is much earlier than any date which you could expect it. Again, well, Jericho was destroyed, and this the story in Joshua about the destruction of Jericho is not an invention. It's not. It was probably a legend. There was a memory. There was once there was a city there, and it was destroyed. But it doesn't mean that it was destroyed by the Israelites. It doesn't mean that it is connected.
While Zeev Herzog acknowledges that Jericho was destroyed, the common date given for that destruction is just too early for him to connect it to the Israelites.
Okay. So, Herzog here, I'm going to use the German pronunciation of his name because it looks German. Herzog, he does get a couple of things right. I'm not saying he's completely wrong. However, and he seems to play off what most scholars think of Jericho and the conquest is that, especially Jericho here, we'll just limit it to Jericho. He seems to think that this idea that Jericho was destroyed, and it was in the 16th century, there is evidence that Jericho was destroyed in the 16th century. This was put forth first by Garstang, who attributed the destruction to the 15th century, and then Kenyon came along and said, this was 16th century. And that's where we've dated it now. It's in the middle of the 16th century, this destruction layer by Jericho that he's referencing, that Dr. Herzog is referencing here. However, but he gets he gets it right. Most scholars think that because the city was destroyed in the 16th century, there was a legend. It became legendary, and the account that we have of Joshua, that the account that we have that in the book of Joshua is based off of something like that, based off of that destruction layer, and it just became legend and stuff, and then the writer of Joshua decided to pen it and then insert it in the Old Testament. That is the theory. At least that's what most scholars, some scholars, I shouldn't say most, but some scholars think of it. Now, recently, and I want to say recently, as of 2 or 3 years ago, we have evidence that was just released from an Italian archaeologist by the name of Lorenzo Nigro. And he has a paper. You have access to it's access to the public, so you can check this out for yourself. Lorenzo Nigro published a paper, or he uploaded a paper to academia.edu on excavations in Jericho. Now, what's interesting is that Kenyon found a cemetery back when, but no city, until Lorenzo Nigro discovered a city that was rebuilt by mud brick walls. And I'll bring up the paper and everything here in a minute. Additionally, though, Dr. Brian Wood discovered a seal or ring bearing the name of Amenhotep III on this same site, who died around 1351, which is problematic even for the early date Exodus. So this discovery would date the cemetery that Kenyon found and the rebuilt city of Jericho that Nigro found in the late Bronze Age. That is to say, Jericho in the late Bronze Age was rebuilt with mud brick, which explains the lack of a destruction layer found. There hasn't been a destruction layer found in the late Bronze Age. Now, what I'd like to do here is go into Lorenzo Nigro's paper here. And I want to read from his paper here. So I'll start here at the beginning of Jericho in the late Bronze Age, 1550 to 1200 BC. So the city of Jericho was still occupied in the late Bronze Age, although in a reduced scale. The burnt and collapsed MB, that is Middle Bronze Age, 3 defensive system was refurbished by adding a mud brick wall on top of the surviving crest of the Cyclopean wall. And he lists a figure here of 25, which I think, I can't find it. I think it's down further. Maybe it's up here. Is this it? Here it is. Here's a picture of the Cyclopean wall that he's referencing. Did Garstan? I'm not sure if Garstan took this picture. Or if someone else did. But here's a picture of the Cyclopean wall. It looks like Garstan took it. So moving on. The palace was scaled, the palace in Jericho, was scaled to a residency called the Middle Building, while there is no evidence concerning the temple, so they haven't found a temple. So, but the most notable finds of this period are 2 royal signet rings bearing the insignia of Amenhotep III and the ceramic assemblages from Tomb 5 excavated by Garstang in the 30s. The almost complete absence of any reference to Jericho in the Armana letters contrasts with the discovery by Garstang of an administrative tablet dating from this same period, which is a substantial piece of evidence in favor of the existence of a palace and a city during the 14th century. So what's this mean? This means that there was continual occupation until the late Bronze Age. Now, with Herzog, I will say the Patterns of Evidence film, their documentary series, was released in beginning in 2015. So this information was unknown to Herzog and the rest of us because this was recently put forth by Lorenzo Nigo in 2019. So this is just updated information from what I'm reading, the paper, what I'm reading. So I just wanted to bring that to light.
Possibility of shifting the dates for Canaan's archaeology forward by centuries to line up with Jericho's destruction with the Bible's conquest is just too radical for most to consider.
It is.
However, Kent Weeks confirmed that Egypt's history is not yet a settled matter.
Chronology is one of the big bugaboos in archaeology, in history generally, and especially in terms of ancient Egypt. And there are many problems with Egyptian chronology. And I think we will all agree that those problems magnify the further back in time we go, but even in more recent periods.
Which is understandable, because the further back in time you go, the less archaeological and textual evidence we have. That makes perfect sense. The closer you get to our time period, the more evidence we actually have. At least theoretically. And we actually can support this. Just because there's a dark age like the Third Intermediate Period that Dr. Klein thinks that happened, and the rest of academia thinks that happened at the in the 12th century, we still have evidence, still stuff there, like archaeological evidence that we can rely on. Now, of course, when you switch to the Levant, there really isn't anything to go on until you get to like 853 with the Battle of Karkar, which was a significant battle between the Assyrians and a coalition. So, while, yeah, there was a period of Dark Age. I don't even like using the word Dark Age, to be honest. But there is some archaeological evidence going on that we can piece together what's going on in that third intermediate period in Egypt in particular. So, to label it a dark age for me is a bit problematic, but we digress.
Late period history, there are still some problems. That said, the chronology of Egypt is still a lot better founded than the chronology of most other parts of the ancient Near East, which means that Egyptologists have two great problems here in dealing with chronology. One is to get a chronology that is internally consistent and satisfies the needs of those people working in Egypt. But then the other is to get a chronology that will be accepted by scholars in other areas of the ancient Near East, because when all is said and done, it's the Egyptian chronology that underpins everything else that's being done throughout the rest of the known world. It's a big responsibility, a heavy burden, and it's one of the reasons that people look at it so closely, because in terms of reconstructing ancient history, a lot hinges on the answers.
And he's absolutely right. Dr. Weeks is absolutely right. There's a lot that hinges on ancient Egyptian chronology. And we usually, a decade or two, like I said, when I say give or take a few years, usually it's a decade or two, as far as disagreements with time frame. I think it's even less than that, to be honest. Lorenzo Nigo dates the end of Amenhotep III's reign in 1352. I said 1351 just a few moments ago. But 300 years is a bit drastic.
Kent Weeks made no indication that he'd be in favor of anything as major as shifting Egypt's history by centuries.
And he won't. He won't. Kent Weeks, Dr. Weeks, will not. He doesn't support this radical change either. I guarantee you. I don't know if he said that, but I guarantee you he doesn't.
The reality is, a shift wouldn't just affect Egypt, because the archaeological dates for Canaan and the surrounding region are all dependent on Egypt's history. So if Egypt's historical dates are not that certain and need adjusting, then Canaan's history would also require the same kind of shift, because they're connected.
But a lot of people don't want to do that.
No, because Egyptian chronology has been assumed to be fixed now for a very long period of time. So the whole idea of taking it apart and starting again is anathema to most Egyptologists.
Because it would undo a lot of their books, wouldn't it?
Well, it certainly would, yes.
Although Bimson and Rohl propose that Egypt's timeline needs to be revised by centuries, others believe that the dates are only off by a decade or two at most, and they do not consider a major shift to be a possibility.
Do you think that it's difficult to really understand how to date some of this?
Oh, I think it is. Yes, it can be difficult. One has to realize that that they don't write history as we do today, and they don't use the calendar or the dating systems that we use today. Plus genealogies. You have to be able to be a genealogical researcher. You have to be able to put together these families, and if it's unrealistic, you have to rethink it. So you often have gaps in the genealogical information too. That's typically Near Eastern. So it's a difficult thing, and that's why even today, when you look at dates, accepted dates of kings, we could be off 3 or 4 years either way, or sometimes even more, but not 400 or 500 years or anything like that. That would not be so. But we do have very great limitations when we talk about these things.
David Rohl has suggested that the chronology needs to be, the Egyptian chronology is off, and he's shown actually where there are tombs and there's overlaps. And no one wants to touch the dynasties or deal with that. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not an Egyptologist, but I evaluated his chronology from the Palestinian side and what the impact would be on, our knowledge of the archaeology of Canaan and biblical events and so on. And it can't work. There's too many problems. You got the Philistines in the divided monarchy and all kinds of crazy things going on.
And Dr. Wood's absolutely correct. It just creates more problems. Again, I said earlier that the Philistines, a portion of the Sea Peoples, invaded Egypt unsuccessfully and then had to migrate, or at least find a new place to live, and they settled the Pentapolis, which is the southern Levant. You can't have that in the divided monarchy with Israel and Judah existing. So,
and that we know didn't happen. So I've written an article on that responding to his chronology, and I don't think it's valid. He creates more problems than he solves. That's the problem with his chronology.
Your chronology that you're working with is linked to Egyptian chronology.
Right, especially in the earlier periods. That's great.
So do you feel confident about the Egyptian chronology?
Yes, Egyptian chronology is well established, and most scholars, well, there are minor differences, again, in interpretation, but basically the Egyptian chronology is very sound.
Is there a pattern of evidence earlier in history that would have matched the biblical story, but the chronology is just not matching up? In other words, if your time period was earlier, would evidence of the conquest and evidence be different for your interpretation?
This is exactly what some scholars try to do in order to overcome the conflict between archaeology. I don't think that it is possible, because again, there are so many broken links in this chain that you cannot put them together.
So you don't see if the chronology was shifted, like I've talked to other scholars, and they said the problem is the chronology. They say that the chronology is inflated, and if the chronology was taken out, that the biblical stories would match exactly. And that's the reason why people such as yourself can't accept it, because what the late Bronze Age is saying is there's no evidence here. Well, it happened in the Middle Bronze Age.
Yeah. Okay, well, it happened in the Middle Bronze Age, but we have no evidence of the presence of a Jewish people in the Middle Bronze Age.
And he's absolutely right. We have no evidence of an Israelite nation in the Middle Bronze Age. We just don't. And again, I would direct people to Deuteronomy 7:7, which says it was a mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, and not an Israelite nation. It's just not there. There's just a mixed multitude that left Egypt. And there's also extra biblical evidence of an exodus of people leaving Egypt. Again, the papyri of Anastasia, etc. So, and then archaeological excavations, again, by Manfred Bietak, at least in Tel El Daba, which, if I'm not mistaken, that should be Avaris. And these things seem to support, at least in my humble opinion, a late Exodus. So
this is impossible, and we do have so much information. This is kind of what I say is excuses we used to do when we still, all of us, subscribe to the biblical archaeology concept, and we believe that this is historical. So we looked for solutions how to overcome the discrepancies. There are so many anomalies now. There are so many contradictions that you cannot put it together unless you are a very great believer.
I heard these kinds of dismissals many times before, but they didn't provide enough specifics to make their case. So how could I really evaluate the arguments and make an informed decision? These arguments also seem to be ignoring the pattern of evidence matching the Bible. This led me to wonder if these conclusions are based on a careful examination of all the evidence, or are they attitudes based on other factors? It seemed that the same slogans are often repeated. but I have found that many scholars are actually unfamiliar with the revisionist proposals put forward by Rohl and others.
Well, some people would say that if you look for an exodus, when you look for the collapse of the Egyptian culture, you wouldn't look in the time of the Ramesses, because that was the height of Egyptian culture. You would look at a time previous to that when it was like a dark age. That's what David Rohl has told me, that that's why he sees a space for it to happen earlier in the Middle Bronze Age. What do you say to that?
Well, we still have the reality of the text as we have it. I don't think even if we went with the so-called biblical chronology and put a 1447 Exodus date, David Rohl wants to even push it back earlier. So that's not according with any biblical chronology. I think it's very dangerous to create a scenario to look for geographical mountains or places and think this must be where this event took place, and then adjust the biblical text or the historical text to fit that reconstruction. So I'm dubious of that.
This view, however, misunderstands
Definitely agree with Hoffmeyer here. Rohl seems to be shoehorning certain things to fit his narrative so that he can change the timeline by 300 years. I'm sorry, guys. I seem to be having a frog in my throat tonight. But I would have to agree with I would have to agree with Hoffmeyer here and say that it just seems like he's shoehorning certain things to fit his narrative and his thesis that we need to change the timeline.
David Rohl's proposal. As shown in the film, he uses the traditional biblical date of 1450 BC for the Exodus and only shifts the Egyptian timeline to produce the alignment.
Unless I think it was more than 2, but that's fine.
What's not changing is the Bible timeline, because that's not affected by it. If you're changing the Egyptian timeline, you're moving it against the Bible timeline. So all of a sudden, things that were not in the right time period between the two are suddenly lining up in a different way. And that's the exciting bit, because that's when we suddenly start to find evidence for the biblical story.
Other scholars are put off by the idea of a radical timeline shift because of the writings of a Russian-born psychiatrist, Immanuel Velikovsky. In his 1952 book, Ages in Chaos, Velikovsky claimed that there were major flaws in Egypt's chronology, and he proposed radical shifts for Egypt's timeline. But he was not formally trained in archaeology and Egyptology.
Absolutely, and you'll hear this in a few minutes. Velikovsky wasn't even trained in Egyptology, so he doesn't know archaeology. He doesn't know the Egyptian language, but he wrote a book on it. That's a red flag. That should definitely be a red flag right there.
And apparently he made major mistakes that made it easy for scholars to dismiss all of his ideas.
There has been a New York psychiatrist who didn't know anything about Egypt. He pretended he did. He wrote a number of books, mainly about chronology, and he used our papyrus as his starting point.
When he says our papyrus, I'm 90-something% sure he means the Leiden papyrus, which is where he's a curator. So, just to give clarity, you can, again, if you Google that or if you just do your own research on Google, I actually didn't bring it up, but the Leiden papyrus is a pretty famous papyrus in Egyptology, so.
To show that conventional chronology of antiquity has been muddled up by these stupid scholars. He says there's a mistake of 600 years. He wants to prove that the events that are described in the papyrus of Ipuwer are identical to the ones mentioned as the 10 plagues of Egypt in the Bible. Can this be true? Well, I already gave you the time frame that Egyptologists stick to. Then it wouldn't be possible. Can you really assume that two descriptions of natural phenomena prove that we are talking about an identical event, one and the same event? I don't think so.
Even though I asked about David Rohl's proposal, Martin kept going back to the book by Velikovsky. I actually just filmed David Rohl. Now, David Rohl would say, no, there's a new chronology. The Egyptian chronology is off by 300 years, and he points to the Ipuwer papyrus as being an eyewitness account.
Yes, well, as I said, that this...
Now, before he answers Mahoney here, I should like to mention that, yes, the Ipuwer papyrus dates to the Middle Kingdom, but it lists certain things. It lists calamities that happened to Egypt, or that would have happened, that would have happened or could have happened to Egypt, and it's no surprise that it revolves around the Nile, and etc., which has led some scholars to believe that the Exodus narrative in the book of Exodus, well, that didn't happen as well, and blah, blah, blah. But with the Ipuwer papyrus, and when it was written, that doesn't really seem to be the case. So, I'll let him explain it here, though. That's why I'm kind of speaking in generalizations. I don't think he goes much in the Ipuwer papyrus, but I think he delves a little bit into it. So.
Velikovsky, the psychiatrist from New York, used this clash of evidence, this problem, as his point of departure that ancient chronology makes a mistake of 600 years. That's a very strange statement, but okay, let's read his book. I did. On almost every page, he mentions things that are utterly impossible, because he can't read the hieroglyphs, he misinterprets the evidence, he doesn't understand the Egyptian representations. There are grave mistakes on every page. So if this book has to convince us, forget about it.
Yeah, that particular, and I don't know which one you're talking about. I haven't read that one.
He started all this in the 60s.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm more familiar with David Rohl's New Chronology.
Velikovsky's proposed shift was nearly twice as large as David Rohl's, and Rohl bases much of his system on hard data from within Egypt. So other than the big idea of a major time shift, I don't think the two really should be lumped together. And for those who would oppose any kind of radical revision, it should be pointed out that other scholars propose radical ideas of their own.
Not really. They don't propose radical ideas all the time. No one advocates something as radical as changing the timeline 300 years. They might present new ideas at RC, which is the annual conference held by Egyptologists. They might present new ideas, but there's nothing as radical as changing the timeline 300 years.
Israel Finkelstein has advocated for moving Solomon back into the Iron Age 1B period, which actually requires an extension or redating of the Iron 1A period by about a century in order to accommodate the Judges period.
And that's just absolutely ridiculous to, excuse me guys, that's just absolutely ridiculous to even think about or propose. To move Solomon's timeline into the Iron Age B is completely ridiculous. That would put him before David. to give you a reference.
And Bryant Wood's proposal to redate Jericho's destruction to the end of Late Bronze I period requires a shift of 150 years from the consensus view.
I will say that we'll conclude it here because we're 50 minutes in and about halfway through the video, but I'll conclude on these thoughts about Bryant Wood. Even Bryant Wood proposes a small change to the Egyptian chronology because he still thinks, it's my knowledge that he still thinks this, that the destruction of Jericho that Elizabeth Kenyon, Dr. Kenyon, dated to 1550 should be redated to 1450. His timeline changes 100 years, which is still pretty radical, at least in my opinion. But certainly not as radical as 300 years. So, we will pick this video up next week, next Friday. If you like this video, please hit the like button and the subscribe button if you guys really did enjoy this. And I will see you guys in the part 2 of the next video. So, see you.